All right. I think that's coming through a little bit. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad that everybody is learning to move into the middle. That's what I like to see. All right. We are continuing this week as I stalled to pull up all of my notes and everything. That's what I'm doing. You know what? We'll keep it that way. We are continuing this week through the story of the Bible. I do not have any slides this week. I'm not going to explain myself. But we don't have any slides. Hopefully in future weeks we will have slides. But we got a lot to go through tonight, or today, excuse me. It is not nighttime. A lot to go through today. We are working through Genesis 4 all the way through Genesis 11. Now we are not going to work every single verse and read every single verse as much as I know y'all want to, because this is the most interesting part of the Bible, because we rarely ever read it, but I love it. But we're not going to read everything, but we are going to get the highlights, and especially remember our theme, the whole purpose of this class, which is the story of the Bible. So what we're focusing on is, where do these chapters fit into the story? I don't have my dates up there like I did last week. One thing that I do need to clarify about class is originally we were going to study the book of Ruth on March 31st. Well, apparently Easter's in March this year, and it's on March 31st. So we're going to push Ruth back, and we're going to do it with Judges, which that works out because the book of Ruth starts with in the time of the Judges. So it kind of helps us out a little bit, keep on track. So March 31st is Easter, and if you did not know that, you now do. But also March 1st through 3rd, Youth and Family Ministry Seminar. The staff, we're super excited about Luke coming in. And so if you have any teens in the youth group, or you ever want to volunteer for the youth group, or you just care about teenagers, come join us that weekend. We're going to have a Friday night session, a Saturday session, and then Luke's going to be with us on Sunday as well as a class, which is why we won't meet that Sunday, 1st through the 3rd, March 1st through the 3rd. Is that what you asked? Okay. Come join us. It's going to be a great time. More details on what the sessions are going to be will come out later. Start looking on the church website. If you go to events, I will have everything up on there, so that way you can sign up and we'll know how many people are coming. It is free. You don't have to pay to come. So come. If you want to volunteer, have a teen in the youth group, or you just care about teens and you want to learn more about youth and family ministry, come join us that weekend. All right. We are diving back into this. A little review from last week. We talked about Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and the big thing that I wanted us to look at and realize the two paradigms that are created with Genesis 1 and 2, and then Genesis 3. So Genesis 1 and 2 becoming a paradigm of perfection, of harmonization. We see the themes of Genesis 1 and 2 occur throughout the rest of the Bible. We'll see them whenever we dive into Exodus and we start reading about the tabernacle. See, the tabernacle, the place where they go to offer sacrifices, to redeem themselves from their sin with the priest and to God. Well, the tabernacle seems to be set up a little bit like Genesis chapter 2. We see the tree of life. We see other things in these themes. So this paradigm for perfection and harmonization, we see it in the structure of Leviticus. We see it in the beginning of Matthew and John. Remember, Matthew starts exactly like Genesis 2:4. This is the book of generations of the heaven and earth. Matthew 1:1. This is the book of genealogies of Jesus Christ. Well, John 1:1 also starts like Genesis 1:1. In the beginning was the heaven and the earth, or in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Well, in the beginning was the Word. So we see this paradigm of perfection and harmonization working throughout the Bible. I don't think I need to describe or explain how Jesus is a perfect person, and this paradigm continued from the Old Testament into the New Testament. Well, Genesis 3 becomes this paradigm then of failure. And every time afterwards, we see the Israelite people or the people of God start to fail or fall away from God, reverse the image that was planted within them. We're reminded of the original image reversal that we have in Genesis 3. We see this throughout the Bible and all the way into Revelation. The iniquity of Revelation 12 reminds us of creation and reminds us of the serpent coming to deceive mankind and this enmity that we have between man and sin. So that's what we talked about a little bit last week. Today, like I mentioned earlier, we are going to be talking about Adam leading all the way up to Abraham. So Genesis 4 through 11, which covers about thousands of years of history, which is going to be a lot of fun because we got 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes because I tend to go long. So Genesis 4. So the basic premise that I want us to get from this, because there's a lot in this chapter, and we'll poke at a couple of the things, especially a couple of the very confusing things, like what's going on at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6. Who are the Nephilim? Who are the sons of God? We'll look at them a little bit, but what I want us to realize or want us to truly look at is what these chapters are about. Genesis 4 through 11. They are about the continuation of evil. It is the outworking of Genesis 3. So what you'll notice within Genesis 4 through 11 is this continuation of evil continue to happen. We get it all the way, we get it starting in verse 4, and it continues to build and expound upon itself throughout all the way Genesis 11, where it ends with the genealogy leading up to Abram. And then Genesis 12 starts the patriarch story, which we'll dive into next week. All right, let's look at Genesis 4. And let's remember that Genesis 4 through 11 is the effect of Genesis 3, the reversal of Genesis 1 and 2. So a little bit, as we read Genesis 4, let's remember one thing. What is the role of mankind? What were our jobs given to us in Genesis 1 and 2? Fill and subdue the earth. Yeah. What does that mean? Benevolently rule the earth, not exploit it, but continue to rule like God would. I heard something over here. Am I just dreaming? Yeah. Multiply. Continue to fill the earth. Yes, and we see this. Name all, well, that was that. Yeah. Yeah. Know what you're being stewards of. I like that. I like that. Well, we see in Genesis 4 this start to happen, but instead of the original command and, creation working with itself and helping each other out, well, now we see this command and creation start to fight back. And that's what we see starting in Genesis chapter 4. All right. Well, let's look at this. Genesis 4, Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. I'm going to read it, and then I need someone to summarize these two verses. It's going to be hard, but you can do it, I promise. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. Now the man knew his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a cultivator of the ground. All right, what happened? They had children. Yeah, they multiplied. All right, yes. We've got to the beginning of the commandment. They're living out the commandment. They multiply the earth. What's weird about this? I know y'all are probably thinking, nothing's weird. They had kids. Why is that weird? Well, there is something weird here. What's weird about it? How'd they know to have kids? Well, they said be fruitful and multiply. Why? Go ahead. Adam isn't mentioned. Well, he's mentioned as just the man. Yeah, that is weird. Did I hear something else? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. So you have two sides of it. You have just the man who is really only mentioned as the man. Mind you, Adam's name means man. I'm not sure if that's the word that's used here. I haven't actually looked at it. But Adam's name means man, but he knows his wife, which this is beautiful. Highly encouraged. Dive into some Hebrew poetry and look at what this word means. Because in the Psalms, it talks about the Lord knowing us from birth. So there is this intimate aspect of it. But create sons, create children in order to help them till the land, which is what we see in Genesis, or in verse 2. Abel was keeper of the flocks, and Cain was cultivator of the ground. Sorry. Could she have become pregnant before the fall? I don't see why not, because the commandment, be fruitful and multiply, comes before the fall. So I don't see why not. Probably wasn't as painful. That's what we hear in Genesis chapter 3. Yeah. Something else that's weird that I want to notice. There are no females born so far, which is going to be really weird whenever we get to the end of chapter 4. Michael? Didn't know that. That is interesting. Yeah. And I think that is true, because we see at the end of Genesis 4 what I was referring to earlier. Cain has a wife, but no woman was ever mentioned of ever actually being born. Now you can make all the speculations you want about who that wife is, but that's not what this class is about. Something else that I want to notice, and it's kind of along the lines of the firstborn, like what Michael was talking about. Remember when I said a couple of weeks ago, this idea of the firstborn is very important. They are the heirs. Okay, so we have in Genesis verse 1, she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Now, Eve, some speculate Eve is trying to find good favor with God, considering what happened in chapter 3. Like, I am still relying on God to give me this. Not literally like we have Mary and Jesus, or in God helping Mary out in that way, but in the sense of I'm relying on God to give me these kids. But she gives all the praise to her first kid. And then Abel only gets, and she gave birth to his brother Abel. That's interesting, because we know the rest of the story, right? We know what happens through the end of Genesis chapter 4. I think that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is the use of the divine name here. See, the divine name has not yet been revealed to the people. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's occurred all over the place. Genesis chapter 2, Genesis chapter 3 had it. Anybody see the all caps Lord in their Bible? That's the divine name. Well, the divine name isn't given to the people until when? Anybody know? Moses, specifically what chapter? At the burning chapter, Exodus chapter 3. So that's where we have the giving of the divine name. And something else interesting happens in, this is important, and I'll get to it here in just a second. The divine name has not yet been revealed. That's Exodus 3. Exodus 6, verse 3, and I'm reading the Jewish translation because I think it's very important. This is what Exodus 6, verse 3 says. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. Your Bibles may say God Almighty. But I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yahweh, or the Lord, in all caps. This is very interesting, because the divine name happens all over the book of Genesis. Abraham uses it in Genesis chapter 14 when he's talking to Melchizedek. So what's going on here? What's happening? Because Exodus 6 tells us, well, when I revealed myself as El Shaddai. Now I know it says Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we're talking about Eve here. So I'm just assuming that the name hasn't actually been revealed to Eve yet. Maybe it did, maybe it has. It's not in the text, so I don't know. So it's all speculation. Here's why this is important. I believe this gives us context for who is reading this passage originally. It gives us context for who this book was given to first. It's given to a people that would know the divine name. So while it's used in speech, like Abraham uses it, or Eve uses it here, while it's used, they may not know it right then and there. Remember, Eve isn't writing down Genesis. It's written down much, much later. The people who's writing it, to whom it was originally given, would have known the divine name. Thus, we can assume a lot based on context what's going on in the rest of the passage. So we know the people who are reading this know the divine name. We can also assume that the people who are reading this are a certain type of culture which are going to understand a lot of things that's about to happen in verses 3 through 7 that might not make sense to us. Like, why does God accept Abel's offering and not Cain's? Well, this gives us the context to go, oh, well, maybe there's something more there. Maybe there's something that the original readers would have understood that we don't quite understand. I think that's super important, and we see it in verse 1. All right, so let's keep moving in. Okay, moving on. Genesis 4, 3 through 7. I'll continue to read so that way our people on our stream can hear it, but follow along. And like the last time, someone's going to get to summarize this one. If you ever wonder what class is like for your teens, I make them summarize a lot. So let's follow along. Starting in verse 3. Chapter 4, verse 3. So it happened in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. So Cain became angry, and his countenance fell. Literally, his face fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you so angry? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is lying at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." All right, what happened? You can cheat. You can look at your Bible. What happened? Cain became angry. Yeah. Giving him a shot. Yeah. Yeah. Cain became angry, and God was trying to pull it out of him. Why are you angry? What's going on? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Cain and Abel, they're living out their roles, right? Remember, Abel is the keeper of the flocks, but Cain was the cultivator of the ground. So we see this. So Abel, he brings to God the firstborn of his flock, and Cain brings to God not the firstborn of his fruit or of his grain, but just some stuff. He offers it, but not the best. I kind of gave that away. What's the importance of the firstborn within this context, within the context of firstborn of the flock or firstborn of the grain? Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah. What he said, you might not get a secondborn. I think that's really important. If you give up your firstborn, you're giving up your ability to have a secondborn. In a sense, obviously, there's more to it because maybe the parents could have more, but maybe not. Maybe not. And so, the first thing you do is, I'm giving this to God. Not, I'm going to eat and be satisfied. It's, I'm going to give it to God first. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. So, you're right. It doesn't say whether or not it was the best or the worst. What it does, the only thing it gives us is that it's not the firstborn of his fruit or his grain, whatever he's tilling the ground or working the ground for. So who knows? Maybe it tasted really good. Maybe it was good. But there is something to what Randall said. The idea that you're giving the first. Remember, these people, one, how long does it take for a cow or a wheat plant or an apple tree, whatever, to grow and then produce? It doesn't happen overnight, right? No, it takes time. And so you're willing to get rid of the first. Jesus, I'm coming to you in just a second. You're willing to get rid of the first, give it to God, and wait for more. I think that's an important aspect. Jesus, what's up? Mm. Mm. Yeah. 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 And to summarize, it's the idea of fulfilling myself first, and then I'll give it to God. God, I gotta go do this first. God, I gotta study for this test first. I gotta finish this homework first. Then I'll spend time with you. That's ironic because I'm working on a degree in theology. But no, it's God, you're first. Everything else comes after. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So we have Cain coming first. Abel, he's offering his offering first, and maybe Abel saw him and was like, "Well, let me do better," or maybe or both. God saw the heart of man. I mean, we see this in the story of like David. Uh, you're looking at outward appearance, but I look at the hearts, like the meaning. What is actually happening? And maybe Abel was like, "I want to give the best." Maybe they came at the same time. I know it says in the text Cain came first, but they're not offering it at the same time, but maybe they came to God at the same time. So, and Abel was like, I'm going to give the best. Yeah. Well, what led Cain and Abel to give an offering to God in the first place? If you were here with us on Wednesday nights, you might have heard that exact same question because Kevin gave it and I took it from him. What led Cain and Abel to give an offering to God in the first place? They'd been taught, Randall? Mm, mm, yeah, yeah. And the thing that we don't want to lose sight of in Hebrews 11 is by faith. So, yes, they heard, but you can hear and not do, right? Yeah. So, by faith, they offer. It's this sense of gratitude. Like, they're realizing, hey, God did all of this before us. Let's give some back to him. Let's remember what God has done with us. And this is a good thing. We see this through the offering. It doesn't explain, now, the text doesn't explain why, but we know, like I said, the context is important. We know the people who are originally reading this are already giving offerings a lot. Maybe it's during the time of the tabernacle. That's what the tabernacle was for, to give offerings. And it wasn't sin offerings were not the only type of offerings they gave. So they're showing this gratitude. God has blessed them in a way. So Abel has the proper attitude to bring, but Cain does not, like what Randall was saying. So Abel's attitude of thankfulness and loyalty to God shows us a standard of how we should treat God and others. And I love this line from Kevin from Wednesday night. So if you were there Wednesday night, I apologize. But he said, a standard of behavior offers us a challenge. Will you live out your purpose of being God's image and rise to the top, rise up to that standard, or you fall short and destroy yourself and others along the way? Remember, our purpose is being the image of God, giving like God would give, which God would give his best. God continues to give his best. Cain did not. Now, the fruit may have tasted really good, but the idea of a firstborn is a sacrifice. It may not be the best. In their eyes, it was. It was the best. But it's giving up something. All right, let's keep reading. We're starting in verse 8. I'm going through verse 11. Genesis 4, chapter 8. Then Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. Ooh, I need to speed up. Spoke to Abel, his brother, and it happened when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Verse 9. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from God. And now, cursed are you from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Why did Cain kill Abel? Jealousy. Yeah, he was jealous. He was angry. See, Cain thought it'd be easier to destroy the one who lived up to the standard of being of God. Again, thank you, Kevin. God's image, rather than take responsibility on himself to live as God's image. I think that's a really cool line. Well, here's the next question. Where else in the Bible do we see anger equated to murder? Jesus? Mm. Yeah. We see Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talk about this anger. He says, "You have heard that it was said from those of old, 'You shall not murder.' But I say to you, don't even be angry." Yeah. See, we have this equation of angry leading to murder. Now, the next question, I think, that runs in my head is anger a sin? Mm. So do not be angry in your sin. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So what would Jesus do? Breaking out the whip is not outside the realm of possibility.
So anger in and of itself is not a sin. There are plenty of things that you are justified to be angry for, like murder, like abuse, like all these things. And yes, Jesus says, "Do not sin." I think that also is read in context with Ephesians 4, and what Paul says is, "Be angry, but do not sin." Self-control. Yeah. 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 So we see in chapter 4, before Cain ever murders Abel, God says, "If you do well, will not your face be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is lying at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." So anger. Cain, sure, he can be angry. He can be frustrated. Now, his frustration, as we've seen, it's not really justified. He didn't give his full effort to his offering. He may have thought he did, but God let him know that he didn't, and so for next time, he could have done better. Well, instead, while sin was crouching at the door, Cain came in and opened up the door and let him come in. So sin came in, and Cain, out of his anger, murdered his brother. And from there, we see the continuation of this fall. See, notice what Cain is cursed with. In verse 11 and 14, God talks about driving him from the ground. Now, he's literally talking about how, remember Cain's job, cultivator, tiller of the ground. Well, the original curse was, well, the ground's going to fight back, Adam. Cain's curse is, it's not even going to produce for you anymore. So notice the parallels here. So he's driven from the ground, which also I think is a parallel to the end of chapter 3 when Adam and Eve are driven from the garden. They too are driven from the ground in a very different way. But you see the parallel. And then verse 12 of chapter 4, the ground no longer produces for him. It doesn't produce for him. Remember his job, like I said. It produced for Adam, but they fought back. So here we see the end of kind of this first narrative with Cain killing Abel. God drives him. We didn't read 12 through 16. I'm trying to speed up just a little bit. So we see the end of this narrative. Creation, fall, driven from the garden. Cain kills Abel. And now we have the final curse of Cain, where he's going to live his life. From here, from chapter 4, verse 17 through chapter 11, we see this continuing increase of evil. And yes, I recognize fully that in the midst of all of that is the flood. Well, evil continued after the flood. That's why we have Genesis chapter 11. But we see this continuing. So I'm going to pause right here. Up to this point, any questions about the text? This is your time to ask the questions. If not, I'm full steam ahead in the next 5 chapters. Yeah.
There's this constant threat of removal from that which God graciously gave us in the first place and expected us to, again, benevolently rule over. It happens in miniature with Cain, and it happens at a macro geopolitical scale with Israel later on in the
Well, it happens even more miniature. What Kevin said, for those of you who are listening, we have an interesting connection of Cain being driven from the ground. When we fail to listen to what God says, the Israelites are also told, hey, when you fail to do what God says to you, this land that I've promised, I'm going to kick you out. I'm going to take you away from it. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you don't do what I say, the blessings that I've talked about, you're not going to receive. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 It's a sad image because I think you're right. He probably did try, and it probably didn't work. Back to Kevin's comment just real quick. We see the kicking out of a ground or a land before Genesis chapter 4. Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. So this threat is real. God does not just heap up empty threats. He means what he says. He's going to do what he says. Adam and Eve were not faithful. They didn't trust in God. They couldn't stay in the garden anymore. Cain wasn't faithful, became angry, let sin in through his door. God took away his job. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. But in that, God still protects him. Yeah. Yeah. Verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and your face I will be hidden. And I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and it will be that whoever finds me will kill me. So the Lord said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain so that no one who found him would strike him. And then verse 16, I think this is super important. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. I don't think I've mentioned it before, but we start to see through the Old Testament this theme of going east from the Lord, or east of Eden. It is this metaphor for going away from the presence of God. I'm not going to repeat that. We see this, and it is going away from God. So we'll see as we read in Exodus and Numbers, when the Israelites start to fall away from God, they tend to be going east. They tend to be going away. So I think that's super important. Well, from here, from the end, we get the genealogies, and genealogy goes all the way through chapter 5. And if you think the genealogy ends there, we get a little snippet, and then we get another genealogy. Why are genealogies so important? And I know what you're thinking in your head right now. It's just a list of names. It's not. Why are genealogies so important? Okay, yeah. So Matthew 1, we have a genealogy. We also get a genealogy in Luke, so we got at least two in the New Testament. One could argue, and you can talk to Kevin because he's the one who brought this up. One could argue Hebrews 11 is a genealogy in a sense, poetically. Yeah. Okay, so it points from Adam to Christ. These genealogies don't. Someone was paying attention on Wednesday night. Yeah. It reminds the readers of their past. It reminds them where they came from. So yes, Jesus' genealogy is super important because we can look at it and go, hey, that's David. That's an important guy in the Old Testament history. Hey, that's Abraham. Hey, that's the beginning of all of this redemption. That's the original family. That's an important guy. Now, we may not know the names in this genealogy, but the original readers would. And they see that important. It reminds them of their story. It reminds them of where they came from. I mentioned this on Wednesday night. The first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles. If you don't believe me, go open it to 1 Chronicles right now. 9 chapters of just straight Hebrew names. If you ever want a Hebrew name for a dog or your kid or whatever, 1 Chronicles 1 through 9. There's an endless list to choose from. You might not be able to pronounce it, but it's there. The first 9 chapters, straight genealogy, leading up from the time of creation all the way to the time of David. They're retelling their history. They're retelling the story that got them to where they are. By the way, the book of Chronicles, it's in the middle of our books. Well, it's at the end of the Jewish Old Testament. Because the book of Chronicles was written after the exile to a people who had totally forgotten their history. And they needed to be reminder. And it occurs at the end of their Old Testament as a message of hope. God is still working. God is still there. That's what is important about these genealogies. Right here we have a genealogy to be compared. We have Cain's genealogy and Adam's genealogy. It would be so much easier if I could just throw up on the screen and show you what I'm about to talk about. But notice this. We have a lot of names that sound very similar. And we also have some names that are the exact same. Like the first name in Cain's genealogy, a man by the name of Enoch, who describes himself, or is described within the text that says, Cain knew his wife. We don't need to talk about that. She conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city he called the name of the city Enoch. So Enoch built a city and named it after himself. Well, we also have an Enoch in Adam's line. What do we know about this guy? Yeah. He walked faithfully with God, and God took him away. So we have this comparison of the two lines, line of Cain and line of technically Seth, but we'll go with Adam because that's the first name in chapter 5. We have the Enoch who's selfish and names a city after himself. And we have the Enoch who walks faithfully with God. We also have two Lamechs. See, Lamech in Cain's line is the first person we see to take two wives and to be this domineer, this person dominating who he is over. It says, well, whatever happens to Cain, whatever happens to Lamech is 77-fold. So he tries to be worse than Cain. Well, the Lamech in Adam's line is the father of Noah. We don't know much more about Lamech, but we do know that he gives birth to Noah. And what's important about Noah? Yeah, he's devout. He builds the ark. So we see these genealogies, and we see this continuation of, I think it's a symbol. Yes, they're real genealogies, but I also think they can stand as a symbol, continuing the curse of chapter 3, sin. Hey, there we go. That's what I was talking about. I have highlights on there, but who knows where they came from or went. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. So we see this continuation of Genesis chapter 3 where sin and man continues to battle back and forth. And I think the genealogies can become a symbol for that. Because on one side we have Enoch, a prideful man names a city after himself. Lamech, who wants to be worse than Cain. But on the other side we have Enoch, a faithful man of God. Or Lamech, the man who births Noah. So these genealogies, they're super important. Now, they are not lines of faithfulness. Who's to say that someone in Cain's line couldn't be faithful to God? It can happen. Who's to say someone in Adam's line can't become unfaithful to God? Potato. He's still his father. You're right. It is a little different. Okay, so we continue the story, and we continue to see sin and man fight each other. We continue to see this evil increase. All right, let's turn to chapter 6. Don't worry, I won't make any of us read chapter 5. I know Hebrew names, they're so much fun, but I won't make y'all read any of them. Chapter 6. Chapter 6. All right, I'm going to read the first 8 verses. Genesis 6, verse 1. Now it happened, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. All right, here's our women that are being talked about. They're finally being born, and they're also continuing the command from Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Okay. Verse 2. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men were good in appearance, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he indeed is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Then Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Jeez, I can't even read English. Those were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw the evil of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Whew. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. All right, what's happening? What's going on? Yeah, people don't have self-control. Yeah, sin is becoming an issue. Yeah, what else? Yeah, angels have intermingled. Yeah, what else? Yeah, sure. Yeah, angels also are referenced as being splendor. We see this in Daniel. Um, yeah, so we have this weird. Does anybody else Bible translate it as angels, or is it just sons of God? Sons of God, sons of God, sons of God. Yeah, so this is a Hebrew marker for a sort of deification of certain things. So we can see the opposite of it in the phrase son of man. Has anybody ever heard of the phrase son of man? So son of man is a fancy Hebrew way of saying human being. And sons of God is a fancy way of saying either angelic, so angels, or a certain level of deity. Now, this is no claim to saying that these people were on the same level as God. That's not what this phrase is about. But it is saying a certain sort of classification. It's also not saying that these sons of God are literally being fathered by God, by Yahweh. That's not what this phrase is trying to say. It is simply a phrase of classification. So these angels or these lower level deities or whatever are sleeping around with the daughters of man, which this is your classic ancient Near East thought, that gods would come down. That's lowercase g. Gods would come down and sleep around with human beings. This was a normal thought. Remember the importance of context and who's originally reading this? This is a big passage to remember the context originally who's reading it. So we see this, I think, the general theme of what's going on. We can get bogged down by everything. Who are the Nephilim? By the way, Nephilim literally means fallen ones. So it could be referring to angels, could be referring to, there's some scholars out there that think that it's also referring to kings in the land, ruling over people, being the dominating type like Lamech. But the Nephilim are also the giants mentioned in Numbers 13. Remember the spies that go into the promised land? They see the Nephilim. They see these giants. So we have that kind of connection. But I think the main idea of what's going on is mankind continues to be seduced by other things that are not the Lord God, that are not Yahweh. Evil continues to increase, and they continue to corrupt their image. They continue to fall away. So God needs to wipe them out. We have the flood. We know the story of the flood. So God tells Noah, gather 2 of every animal and load them 2 by 2. Oh, and some fit in there somewhere, 7 kinds of clean animals. Story might be a little bit different than what you learned back in the VBS days, but nonetheless, bring animals onto the ark. Bring your family onto the ark. And I'm going to save you. I'm going to wipe out everything else, and we're going to restart. So the flood happens. The flood eventually dries up, and we get at the end of chapter 8, the beginning of this covenant. I want to read this. Chapter 8, verse 20. I know we're moving fast. We just skipped like 40 days. 8, verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took up every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma. And the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again strike down every living thing as I have done. God isn't going to curse the ground anymore. Sound very similar to some other curse made in a previous chapter that we read sometime last week. Chapter 9, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Sound familiar? And the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky with everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. Sound familiar? Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you, as with the green plants I give all to you. It's the promise. Genesis 1 and 2. God is reinstating Noah as his covenant family. I am giving this to you. Rule over it. Have dominion over it. Verse 11, indeed, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, and there shall never again be a flood to destroy the earth. This is the sign of the covenant which I am giving to you between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I will put my bow in the cloud, and that should be a sign of covenant between me and the earth. We like to think of the rainbow, and rainbow is a really cool sign because when does a rainbow occur? After it rains. Well, there's also this ancient Near Eastern context of putting your bow in the air as a sign of, I'm done. As a sign of, this is me saying it's finished, and I will continue to do what I actually say, which I think is really cool. So God promises life from here, but is evil still in the world? Very much so. Verse 18, verse 18, we have the story of Ham doing something awful to his father. If you're ever curious about that, come see me after class and I can talk about it because we're almost done. But Ham does something evil to his father in a time of vulnerability. So he says, cursed be Canaan, never heard of that name, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. And so then we have a genealogy, and this genealogy of evil continues. I just want to read a couple of names in Ham's genealogy. Whenever I find it. Okay, the sons of Ham, this is chapter 10, verse 6, were Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. Ever heard of Canaan land? Okay. Verse 7, the sons of Cush were Seba, and Havilah, and Sapta, and Rama, and Sabateka, and the sons of Rama were Sheba and Dedan. Now Cush was the father of Nimrod. That's a fun name. Verse 11, this is what I want to get to. From that land he went out to Assyria and built Nineveh, Reboth, Earth, and Kala. Ever heard of Assyria? They loved the Israelites, right? No. If you can't hear the sarcasm in my voice, go read the book of Jonah. It also, as we read throughout Ham's line, we see people like Egypt. Do they spend a lot of time in Egypt? Yes. We continue to see the sin working out through these genealogies, and eventually we get to chapter 11, and we have the story of the Tower of Babel. Man continues to be evil. My favorite part about the chapter, they said, verse 3, chapter 11, verse 3, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had tar for mortar, and they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Verse 5, this is my favorite verse in this story. Then the Lord came down to see a city and the tower which the sons of men built. They're trying to build up to the heavens to be like God. And God came down to look at what they were building. It's hilarious. No one's laughing. I barely see smiles on people's faces, but that's funny because they can't be like God in that sense. So, yeah, but they were going to try. Maybe, but it's still funny. So the Lord confuses their language, scatters them on the earth, and we have this final genealogy that leads us all the way to Abraham. Abraham being the important man, Abram. He's not Abraham yet. Being the important family that continues the covenant, renews another covenant, and starts the line leading, yes, to David, but in our context, leading all the way to Jesus. Next week, we will dive into the patriarchs. So if you thought chapters 4 through 11 was a lot, we're going to do chapters 12 through 35 next week. So come prepared, come ready for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to look at the patriarchs, and then we'll eventually get into Joseph's story. Let's pray, and then we'll be dismissed. God, thank you so much for everything. God, thank you for the blessings that you give us. Lord, I pray that as we study this story, as we look through it, Lord, I pray that we don't get bogged down in the details, but Lord, I pray that we see you in the story. And we see how you're working through these people's lives. And Lord, I pray that we know that you continue to work in our life. Lord, thank you for the blessings that you give us. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Y'all have a great week.